Good evening. I'm going to go ahead and call to order the June 10th Council Committee work session. This evening we have one agenda item, and that's titled Financial Review, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. This is part one of a two-part work session. The second half will take place in July at our regularly scheduled work session. This evening we're going to take a look at how we ended 2013. You'll recall that during budget deliberations last year there was some discussion around our financial policy and a desire on the council to review those in a fair amount of detail before we receive the proposed 2014 budget. So that's one of the things that has prompted this work session and this review of our existing financial policies, which we'll get into following a look back at how we closed out 2013. So this evening we'll have a general discussion, an opportunity for questions, and if there's any requests for additional information, it would be a good time to identify those requests so that our finance director, Diane Marcotte, can get that information to us. This evening we are joined with the city administrator, Bob Harrison, our finance director, Diane Marcotte, and Beth Ann. So with that, that concludes my introductory remarks, except one of the most important responsibilities the City Council has is to approve the budget. So this will facilitate and help us do that. In order to approve the budget, we spend a considerable amount of time, once the mayor presents the proposed budget to the council, going through, in some have said excruciating detail, on each item in the budget. So with that, one additional announcement. There are two excused absences this evening. Eileen Barber is excused, as is Tola Martz. And so with that, Bob, do you have any introductory comments?
Well, you know, this is a two-part process. So tonight we'll be looking at, as you mentioned, the financial statements that we finished at with 2012. And then we're going to spend some time just talking a little bit about best practices. There is a kind of a standard report issued by Standard & Poor's, which talks about the 10 best management practices. And we gave you a whole lot of financial background information just for your reading enjoyment. But that would be the key kind of report that we wanted to walk through and identify. Because one of the things you'll see was we just got re-rated, and we've maintained our AA+ rating, which is an excellent rating, one below AAA. But one of the goals would be eventually, you know, what type of rating do we want to go? Do we want to achieve a AAA or not? And so one of those aspects would be making sure we incorporate the best practices into our financial policy. And then lastly, we'll have a review of existing policy that council's adopted, and spend quite some time to take a look at that, and some of the changes. And then the finance director and a deputy finance director have put together what we would consider kind of best practices for financial policies that we'll work through and take a look at some of the challenges and policies that we're recommending there. So Diane and Beth Ann are going to kind of partner up today, and then I will throw in here as needed to support them overall, or help answer whatever questions council may have.
So just following up to Bob's comments, for the meeting next month, just to give you an idea, what we'll be doing is working very hard. Our next meeting is July the 8th, and we'll be working really hard to close out the first 6 months of the year. Even with the holiday, I've got everybody on call trying to get the information so that we could bring it to the next meeting, and you can have an understanding of where we're at currently. So that's sort of the today. And then the other more significant piece would be the financial forecast for the general fund going out to 2019. As you know, whenever you do forecasting, it is just merely taking a snapshot in time, and then based upon what you know in that particular period of time, forecasting out those assumptions to future period. And where does the general fund direction look like, going out that far? That gives you, so often at time when council works together, so much of what they do is a lot of the stuff of the here and the now, and it's not very often, even in our personal lives, where you have the opportunity, where you sit down and sort of say, where am I going to be at 5 years from now? And that way, if we need to do some type of a course correction, then we have a little bit of time. Particularly during the Great Recession, a lot of the communities that were using and employing that tool were able to do a course correction really quickly, where a lot of the other communities, we started seeing signs in 2007 that we were going to start going into a decline. Some cities didn't start making adjustments till 2011, but when you're really watching the data and the information, then this community can be better positioned to go out into the future. And then we'll follow up on any of the questions that come out of tonight's meeting that we need to do some additional research on. So that would be what's planned for in the meeting in July. We just completed, it's one of those things where our guidance for developing the financial reports are from the Government Accounting Standards Board. It is a rate study. It is a regulatory body that sets all of our standards for reporting for all governments in the United States. Unfortunately, over a period of time, they have made it more complex. If you took a look at, I think we are 75 pages for our annual report. If you were to look at the annual report of Johnson & Johnson and GE and Ford, it's really down to maybe 10 or 12 pages. And that reports their entire operations. No matter how big or small government is, we have a very voluminous report, and there is a lot of information in it. And so the average reader, it is so complex that the average reader can't get through it. It is very, very difficult. So we hope to just bring out the salient points for you tonight, and then also allow you an opportunity, if you've gone through this information, to help clarify any information. So starting with a little handout, one of the things, as Bob had indicated earlier, we maintained our A+ rating, and today their Standard & Poor's just held their rating for the federal government and A+ on a long-term basis. So that sort of gives you an idea that we're measured in the same way as the federal government, the city of Los Angeles.
So Diane, we're double A plus.
Double A+.
Okay, I thought I heard you say A+.
I said yes. Okay.
She just misspoke.
Yeah. So we're in the ballpark. Going to the handout for tonight under the city council goals, well, we look at financial planning. We also look at it in relationship to the council goals. So for 2013, one of the goals is to become a 5-star city. And I think, to me, part of that means fiscal sustainability for the community long-term and doing that long-range planning. And also for 2014 is to develop and adopt in 2014 a plan for longer-term financial planning for both operations and capital that would be implemented starting in 2015. Some of those pieces we've already began working on, as I've described earlier. And it really isn't necessarily one single document. It's doing a series of steps, a series of studies, and looking at them in totality once we get some of those studies done. So those are some of the things that we're working on in the finance department and with the department directors in moving forward. If you go to page 2 of the handout, for the city of Issaquah, in our budget, we budget for the general fund, and then we have a series of funds called special revenue funds. And when you look at the budget, and compare it to the financial statements, they are going to be different methods of presentation. The budget is done on a cash basis. The financial statements are done on a full accrual basis, and so they don't necessarily mirror up. I am not aware of any city that actually develops its budget on a accrual basis of accounting. Because when you're doing the budget and doing your planning, you're really looking at money in and money out. What can those services buy for the community? So please, when you try to do a crosswalk, you won't be able to do a crosswalk between the two of them. So when you look at our financial statements, the general fund includes special revenue funds under its description of a general fund. And the reason for it is that the majority of the revenue in those special revenue funds is just an allocation of money through council decision-making process. In some cities, some of the things that we have as a special revenue fund are part of the general fund. Some things that we have in the general fund aren't part, they are a special revenue fund. So it's really, that's sort of the beauty is that it's not one shoe fits all on the day-to-day operations. We have the opportunity to break out the different pieces of information.
So Diane, you mentioned that we are one of the few cities that tracks our budget through accruals?
No, most cities do a budget on cash and financial statements
On accrual, okay.
Yes, that's the common methodology.
And that's what we do.
Yes. But then when you try to go from one document to another document, they
Gotcha.
don't crosswalk.
Gotcha.
Because this really looks at money in, money out. This looks at some accounting treatment that is a non-cash, like depreciation. Also what it does is when we buy and report to the council, when we buy pieces of equipment or if we buy land, in the budget we show it as an expense. In the financial statement, it's on the balance sheet. So what I did was, when I realized the difference today, I thought, well, what I'd like to do is break out for the council the general fund versus the special revenue fund, so that you can really take a look at how we did in the general fund. Overall, as I stated at the council goal setting, the departments did, our revenue held pretty much true to what we had anticipated. And overall, the departments did a good job of conserving spending. The reorganization that we did last year had attributed to some of those savings. And so we ended up the year adding some additional dollars to our ending fund balance. So when we look at our unreserved fund balance, we're close to 25 to 27% when we look at it overall. Some of the areas where we had problems in was our sales tax. We were about $900,000 short of our budget expectation. Our revenue for a license, for charges for service and permitting, there's about $400,000 more than what we had anticipated.
Just a supplement, if I could help call your attention to page 10 in your background agenda. And the nice thing about this is essentially what she's walking through, you can see graphically. And it's a little easier to see, like in the lower graph, where some of the variances are on sales tax, for example, from one year to the next. But I think the really neat thing that you see on this chart, at least what speaks to me, is the fact that the pie is split up pretty evenly amongst a whole variety of different tax revenue sources. So we're not super reliant upon one single area as a community. So there's some cities that you'll find that sales tax percentage, like a Tukwila, for example, is going to be probably 50%, if not more, of the overall budget. Whereas for us, it's 22%. So the nice thing about a very diverse tax base in this scenario is the fact that we can handle challenges that may occur to the economy or challenges that may occur, in a certain area, like with the housing recession, seeing declines in overall property taxes, it's still only 17% of our total revenue, whereas a community that's much more reliant on that is going to be much more substantially affected by a depression in a certain area. So that's one of the nice things about the community's overall budget balance. It's just we've got a very diverse source of revenue.
So then, just maybe staying on page 11, what you'll see there is how we spent the revenue that came in. Our largest expenditure, like most communities, is we spend a good portion of our general fund on public safety. As you just remember that this also includes the special revenue fund. So when you look at transportation, it also includes our city street fund. We make about a $2 million contribution from the general fund to the street fund, and that's why it's included as a general fund activity.
Diane, could you pull your microphone a little closer? That red light is blinking at me a little bit.
Can I ask a question? On page 9, we show, under general revenues, rents and leases, we go from 0 to 934,000.
Some of, that one, I'm not sure what it is.
I'm trying to remember, and it's not coming to me, so I'll have to.
Let us do some following.
Okay, thanks.
Stacy, what was the
It's
question?
page 9.
Right.
Statement of activities, and under general revenues, there's a category for rents and leases. And in 2011, we had 0, and in 2012, we went to 934,000,
Okay.
which is kind of a lot.
I know the smaller amounts is the number of houses that we're renting that can't come up with 934,000.
Sure, and if it was those houses, I'm thinking it wouldn't be 0 in 2011, because we've had them for a long time.
One of the things that we have been finding along the way, as we go through and look at the detailed records, we are having to do reclassifications. We're having to change some of the methodology
Sure.
and accounting to bring it up to speed. So as we go along, I'll try to point out where we're making changes and bringing them up to standards, but we follow up on this.
Not till we get to 12.
So the other nice thing on this page, again, is if you look at that relatively small slice where it's interest on long-term debt, which really reflects the fact that our policy's been pay-as-you-go for capital. So the city is not, even though we have substantial capacity to borrow money, as a community, we've chosen not to take advantage of that and essentially pay cash for most of the investments that we've chosen to make in physical infrastructure.
And Diane, looking at, again, page 10, capital grants and contributions, there was a significant difference between 2011 and 2012.
I believe that's part of our prior period adjustment. There was a piece, that was that part. We had a classification error where we needed to record the donation of land and site improvement for Central Park, which we did not pick up in 2011, so it all hit 2012. So that was a prior period adjustment, and that's shown on the bottom of page 9. So that's why that category has such a large variance. Because it was recorded as a contribution to the general fund.
So going over to, was it page 12? Okay, you had your question.
Oh, no,
have
but the question was actually
I
on
do.
10, so,
So business-type activities, the city's utilities increased the city of Issaquah's net position by $8 million, and I wondered, that's significant, and so I wondered what that was from.
$8 million. Net position, I know that we had some capital assets from the previous period that had not been recorded. So part of that is the increase in that position would be what we constructed and we actually brought up into the balance sheet as plant and equipment. And I know that that is a large portion of that.
Okay.
As far as the exact amount of the 8 million, I'm not
Okay.
quite sure. So
I was just curious if, maybe not tonight, but next time we have sort of a breakdown of how we got that $8 million net increase.
Well, and you can see from the last two questions, one of the things we did was we spent about 2 months this year going through all of our fixed assets, donated assets like on utilities or property, and what we were finding was there was many transactions that were not properly recorded or they were not complete. So that caused a lot of these changes as we began finding transactions that weren't recorded in previous periods.
Okay.
Could I ask a favor? Rather than use the page numbers at the bottom of those pages, could you use the page numbers at the tops? Because the electronic files don't have the lower numbers. And some of us are lost.
Well, you can
Because
enter
your
it,
page 12 is my page 7.
7, yes.
Yeah,
yeah, throwing me off.
good point.
I'm sorry?
But you can enter it up top and go right to that page when she says that. There's a little display for the page number. That's what I've been doing in tracking.
Well, except if I'm on page 7, it says it's on page 8. So if I type in page 12, it takes me to actually page 11.
Huh, mine takes me to page 7.
Oh, okay.
So we'll make reference to both pages.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I don't know.
So overall, just to summarize, our business type activities are through utilities, so we're on page 8. And overall, they met our expected projections. As you can see, our charges for services year over year were pretty consistent. We had some increases in capital grant contributions, primarily as a result of some FEMA money that we had received. And then
Diane, I hate,
Fred's getting yelled at.
It's on.
I don't,
It's on.
they're all on.
my
Diane.
husband doesn't say I have that soft of a voice. So our business type activities, as I indicated, our water, sewer, and storm met our expectations. If you go to page 3 of the,
You should switch
Mike,
microphone.
Something's not working.
Maybe it's the mic.
Yeah, try 3 of them.
Like a president.
how are we doing now?
That's better.
You got a solid right still.
Yay.
Okay, so on page 3 of the handout, it's one thing to look at a one-year picture of activity on our utilities. For myself, it's a lot more informative to look at the historical pattern so that you can see any variances or see really what's been happening. So if you look at page 3 on the water operations, this is the same spreadsheet that we provided the council at the 2013 budget workshops, and we've included the actual activity for 2012. Our revenue for the water utility was up. It was up in an amount. We did not have any rate increases for last year. So what this really represents is growth in charges for services, whether it's new customers or some higher water consumption. And then when you look at maintenance and operation and depreciation, they're very consistent with the historical past. So we ended the year in the water utility with operating income of $545,000. It is wonderful to see the fact that our revenue stream was sufficient to cover our depreciation. When we talk about some of the 10 best characteristics in bond ratings, we'll have some discussion on pay-as-you-go versus capital projects. And then the other non-operating revenues would be our interest expense on the existing debt in the water sewer utility. And then we come down a little bit further. So when you subtract the interest on our debt, we're showing a loss before contributions, but there is still sufficient cash to cover the payment of the interest expense on our outstanding debt. Capital contributions was significantly more this last year, once again as a result of doing some cleanup and picking up some transactions that had not been recorded the previous year. And we also had developer-donated assets where we spent more time with Public Works Engineering and having them assist us in the value of assets that people had donated to us when they do a development. So we ended the year very well in this utility. Again, this utility had a rate increase in 2011 of 9%, and you can tell by the operating income just on the surface without looking at capital or needed improvements, but from an operation perspective, that 9% has been able to sustain us over the last several years without really, causing any concern or a need for a rate increase.
So you said it was a 9% rate increase?
Yes, in 2011. Typically, what you'd like to do is to, once again, we'll talk a little bit more about it further on, is sometimes, and it becomes really a policy or a philosophical discussion. Some communities like to do small rate increases every year. Other communities like to do larger rate increases, less frequently. So it really becomes a policy discussion on the part of council when looking at the net operations of each of the utilities. Going over to page 4, you'll see our sewer operations. For 2012, when you look at our revenues over our expenses, we had approximate $500,000 loss. One of the things when I was preparing for the meeting that I noted that we're doing some additional research is the change between revenues in 2011 and 2012. The 2011 financial statements are showing almost $1 million more in collections of the sewer utility for revenue. That just seems off, and we are beginning to do some additional research and work with Public Works Operations to find out if there was something unusual with a business occurring in 2011 that would cause this variance to go back and forth. And then when you look at, on the expense side, it's pretty much consistent with prior years. That results in a $500,000 loss for 2012. But I think it's really important to understand what happened in 2011 to see how it really flows through into 2012. We had around $99,000 in investment earnings. This typically what we do is we'll go out and we'll buy some longer term investments, and when they mature is typically when you get the interest. So that nearly $100,000 to a fund is significant in and of itself. Right now, when we just have our money in the state treasurer's pool, we're earning about 13 basis points. So this is really coming from some longer term investments that we have been holding. And then really capital contribution and developer donated assets. Once again, you can see the difference between 11 and 12. Really think maybe there was some transactions that we just needed to pick up in 2011 that were picked up in 2012.
And so, for the Issaquah Highlands and Talus, have we pretty much picked up all of the assets that we will get from those two urban villages, or are there other significant assets that the city will be picking up as those urban villages sort of wind down?
That I would almost, unless you have some knowledge, I would almost have to talk to Sheldon to see.
Yeah, I don't expect an answer,
Yeah.
just that's just the thought. And you mentioned the council policy on going for larger utility rate increases, less frequent than smaller rate increases sort of every year. And could you flag that perhaps as a policy that at some time we might want to talk about and review that, since we're digging into all of our financial policies?
Yes, if, part of that conversation is the last time we did a rate revenue study and a study of our general facility charges was back in 2002. Typically through that is, just like the long-range financial plan for the general fund, a rate revenue study goes and looks at where are we at today and goes out 5 or 6 years and says, based upon assumptions of growth, based upon various assumptions to cost factor like labor or materials, and then based upon needed capital improvements, they will, the consultants will propose a rate structure. Telling you over the next 5 years you need a 10% rate increase, you need a 30% rate increase, and that's when council begins having a discussion about how do we want to manage that. If we know we need maybe a 2% this year and a 3% next year, but we need a 20% in the following year, let's build some reserves. That's using that as an example.
And so our last rate revenue study was 2002.
Yes.
That was about 11 years ago. And typically, about how often do we, does a well-managed city do rate revenue studies?
Our proposed policy says not less than every 5 years.
Okay. Okay. So I suspect we'll be doing one soon.
Yes. Sheldon and I have been having conversations about getting the estimate cost for that and included in it as a proposal for 2014.
Okay.
It becomes really important especially if you determine there is a need for issuing debt, and then all of that stuff sort of links up together and you have a nice financial plan on where you're going.
Okay.
So going over to the storm utility, once again, the revenue stream is very consistent and stable compared to the historical past. Maintenance operation, you'll see some changes between 2011 and 2012. When we were looking at this information today, what we suspect is that some capital costs may have been expensed in 2011, because as I said, we had to spend a lot of time with the public works engineer getting the cost of, like, what's the cost of construction for linear feet of main, what's the cost of linear feet for sidewalks and those types of things. And I could just tell from working with them, those were questions that they had typically haven't been asked in the past. So we are really working together and working very hard with the public works engineer to get that information as soon as possible. Overall, it had another net operating loss of $519,000. Last year we had $1.6 million, but as I indicated just a second ago, I think some of that is because we expensed a project that had a longer life value instead of depreciating it over the life of the asset. So the $1,680,000 I'm not as concerned about now that I've been getting to understand the financial statements. And then you typically have some of the large...
Ann, but wouldn't we have a fairly consistent policy around what we expense and what we capitalize and depreciate? Aren't those rules fairly well established?
They are, but we have been going through some changes in the accounting, and I think in the past people just didn't really understand what the changes were. In working with some of the staff, we provided a lot of clarification, gave them a lot of information. We actually had one of our employees sit down and do a webinar on capital assets and how to account for that. So we've been spending a lot of time doing more development of the employees. Typically what happens is you sort of figure out how they did it in the past and you sort of follow that model, but that model sometimes changes along the way.
Okay.
So then we have developer-donated assets would be another large one, like storm retention ponds. We put those on our records, and we begin depreciating the development part, not the land part of the construction of it. So that's how we ended 2012 for our utility-type operations. Through this document, there is a lot of starting financial analysis beginning on page 10. There's a lot of information that tells you what we have been doing throughout the year, that if you have a moment, I would encourage you to scan. On page 12, we start talking about some of our major capital projects. We had a very robust program over the last several years, and we've done a lot of projects throughout the year. And once again, in 2013, we anticipate doing a lot more projects.
I'm just going to mention back on page 9 on top, or page 14. The lower graph, one of the things, as we start to do this evaluation, you want to make sure that your dark blue line, your dark blue bar is higher than your light blue bar, because your dark blue bar is your revenue and your light blue is your expenses. So where you start to raise a flag is when your expenses are higher than your annual operating revenues. And so, you take a look at that, and all of these funds still have relatively healthy cash balances, so you're able to cover those from year to year. But the main thing is looking at what the trend line is on those things. So if you do start to see variance in the trend, then that's obviously a flag that you're going to have to look at the overall rates out.
Can't hear you.
I got the special microphone.
Maybe when it's switched to that.
Thank you. So I was just saying that if you'll take a look at the graph on the bottom of page 14 or page 9, the water utility, we're still seeing our revenues exceeding annual expenses. And then the storm and the stormwater, we actually have annual expenses that exceed annual revenues. And as I was mentioning, those funds both have relatively healthy cash balances, and so on a one-year basis, that may be fine. If you start to see a trend line, however, that's where you want to take a look at what the rates are for that year, and potentially make some, or plan to make some modifications. So that's just one of those flags that you need to note.
Hello. And in the financial statements, probably the last thing to note is investments. Overall, we have a cash balance of all of our funds of about $45 million. We had in 2012, we had a couple of very good instruments called early on us as the federal government was redoing those financial instruments. It's not on a page. So we had some instruments that we were earning between 3 to 5%. And what happens is when the federal government issues a bond, they'll often put a call feature in to sort of bet against the future. So if rates are going down, then they can take those instruments, call them, and then reissue them at a lower interest rate. So during 2012, we had about $12 million in investments that were called early as a result of the interest rates. So ending the year, we had very little invested. And since the beginning of the year, I have been what we call laddering between when I actually am buying the investment and how long I put out there for the maturity of it. So when we're here next year talking about 2013 as compared to 2014, we'll see a lot of difference in the investments. Many of the investments I took out to 2015, if not a little bit longer. The federal treasury has said that they're going to be really holding rates through 2015, and so we feel like there is some opportunity to take some of those dollars that have only been earning, like I said, not even 0.25%, and try and earn someplace around between 1.5 to 1.75 during this shorter period of time. So you'll see some differences coming up next year on that. So this is sort of a very large summary of a lot of work and effort that the staff of the finance department put into the financial statements. But I think the bottom line overall, we were fiscally conservative last year, but we still were able to do a lot of capital projects. We were able to deliver services in the high quality that the community expects from us. I think the financial forecast will be an important piece because, like I indicated earlier, we ended up having more money in our ending cash reserves, but through some long-term obligations, we'll be seeing that revenue being used up to fund some things. The other piece that we are just trying to get a better handle on is particularly in our sales tax. What of the sales tax revenue is one-time money versus sales tax that is coming from new development or new businesses. So we're doing a lot of analysis in that arena, trying to get a better understanding of the one-time revenue. Because the last thing you want to do is to roll that one-time revenue with the expectation that you're going to get it next year. So that sort of is leaving the financial statement section. Any questions?
Really appreciate that summary. That's very, very useful information. One of the takeaways for me is looking at our 2012 ending fund balance and seeing that is 25% plus some in terms of our general fund budget. That's pretty significant because I'm looking at a summary of other cities and it varies widely. The highest is 25% for the city of Medina, and the lowest is less than 10%, 8.5% or so. So that's healthy. So what does that mean?
Well, if
I know what the ending fund balance, but what does that mean as far as financial stability or ability? How does that drive the proposed budget for 2014?
If we assume that the 25% was an ongoing measure into the future, that would indicate that we are very strong financially. I do have a little bit of concern. There are some reconciliations of some areas that we have not had an opportunity to work on, that when you look at the financial information, doesn't quite measure up to what I would expect. And some of this information is going to probably take us 6 to 9 months to reconcile because it's a lot of detailed transactions. Additionally, in the sales tax portion, I'm not sure yet if you can assume the 25% would be consistent year to year until we get a better handle of what portion of our sales tax is one time versus ongoing new revenue sources.
Work in progress.
Yes.
Great.
Uh,
Josh?
I have a question that's maybe a little bit out of left field, but I'm still sort of processing a lot of this information, so it took me a few minutes to catch up. The water and sewer funds, when we were looking at those, and the stormwater fund, they're all, the delta's fairly close on a lot of those. And in fact, on stormwater, the revenues are not exceeding the expenditures Bob was talking about, as we were talking about the rates and so forth. How are the two ways, see if I understand, I'll ask it this way, are the two ways that we can ensure the health of those funds to either raise rates or transfer in money from elsewhere? Are those the only two ways essentially to do that?
They're really, I'm not sure what you mean by, typically the utility operations are standalone businesses. So when you look at them, you should look at them in isolation. You might view them as, they're different as a Costco versus a Best Buy versus a Fred Meyer. They're all managed in isolation, although we have crossover on a day-to-day operation. So the only way to bring in additional revenue is by charges for services. There is, unless the only exception under state law is that the general fund can donate money to the utilities. Of all the funds that we have, the only one under state law that can give money to other funds is the general fund. It can't be the reverse. There's a couple of unique circumstances, but if you use that general rule, that would be your approach. So the only way to get more money is to raise rates.
And not, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say that's actually one of the policy questions for council tonight is, should the council policy be on these utility or enterprise funds that they recover 100% of the cost? Or is there some willingness to say the general fund should pick up some portion of those costs? Now, generally, best practice would be that utility should pay 100% of its cost. But there are some communities, for whatever reason, they choose to supplement the utility rates.
So I wanted to tie my question in with something which is ultimately what I was getting at, and I guess asking the question. I didn't say it up front because I didn't know what the answer would be. Tomorrow night I'm going to be looking at the Kahani thing on the Land and Insure Committee, and so I've been starting to look more at those documents. And one of the things that caught my eye was that the stormwater or the water and sewer, or maybe it's all three, there's a cost associated with that. It's about $400,000 one time plus $400,000 a year approximately. And so, if we're looking ahead, I'm trying to figure out where that money is recoverable. And the study suggests that on the revenue side, that because annexation, quote, triggers no automatic change in the boundaries of districts, there would be no changed revenue to the Issaquah water and sewer funds. So I'm trying to figure out where those costs would be borne. Would it be Issaquah ratepayers? Would it be, we'd have to just transfer $400,000 out of the general fund? How do we make up that difference?
Not knowing specifically what you're looking at in the document, but in the Kahani annexation cost-benefit analysis, the study does not address the water and sewer utility because the assumption there is that it would stay with the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District. So I'm not sure what you're particularly talking about. So there it is a net zero impact. On the stormwater utility, we would in fact start assessing our stormwater fee for those houses in that area, and the fee would be on the same basis that we currently charge all of our other utilities. So there would not be an additional impact or burden on the stormwater utility. I do know that we had some increase in costs in public on operations, which is our street and maintenance operation, and I think that might be the document you're looking at.
And that comes out of a different fund?
Yes,
Okay.
It does not come out of the utilities.
So these funds, the answer would be zero?
No,
Impact.
no impact.
No impact. Okay. Thank you.
All right, well, let's continue.
Yeah. It's hard to make this stuff exciting.
Well, I think you're doing a great job, Diane.
Okay, so there's a lot of information in here about Standard & Poor's and Moody's as far as doing a ratings analysis for both our general obligation debt and our rate revenue debt. And it's part of it is just give you an understanding of what they look at, what's important to them. And I think the pieces that has always been interesting to me is they just don't look at the dollars and cents. What they look at is they look at the economics, the demographics of the community. They look at fiscal policy. They look at how you're managing your resources. the one thing I have done some meetings when I was at the city of Tacoma, they'll come out and say, well, how does your council work together? Are they willing to make the tough decisions? And they actually give you a rating score as far as what council, how you manage your policy-making decisions. And I've always thought that was really interesting in that they really take a global look at the community as a whole. We're very fortunate here when you look at the average price of an assessed house. I came from a community, I worked in a community where the average price was $160,000. And so we really got dinged on economic development as a measure of wealth of the community that actually assists in us getting a lower interest rate. And one of the things, particularly if we're looking at a five-star city, your bond rating is a reflection of your community. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about best practices. So if you can go to page 207 of 226, there's not a page number on the top, but it's the top 10 management characteristics of highly rated credits in U.S. public finance.
That page number again?
207.
It would be the last document in that section C, so right before section D.
Can I ask a question while we're all looking for this document? So have these financial statements been presented to council in the past? Do we know?
Not typically.
You say not typically because,
I don't think they were presented to the council in the past.
is it typical to do that? Okay. Are we going to see these regularly then?
Each year.
Okay. And are they posted on our website?
What we typically do is we wait till the financial statements are audited. These are unaudited. So we might have some adjustments based upon the auditor's recommendation. But they are, while we haven't presented them to council in this manner and walked you through the financial operations for the year, the actual audit report is posted online. But it's one of those things where you really have to be bored that night and be looking for something interesting to look at. So, but I think it's really important for you, council, to understand where we're at financially.
Sure. And so will we be posting the audited financial statements online? Okay.
We will.
And the audit typically takes place in the fall?
The auditor this year will be here a little bit later than normal, but will be here in July. And we're hoping he can get through by October. But we also have lots of other types of information. We have our quarterly reports on a cash basis. So there is some financial information out there that the public can follow along and gain an understanding of our operations.
Well, I think our next work session's going to be pretty exciting if you deliver on what you promised us earlier by having, the first 6 months to sort of see how we're doing and then begin forecasting how you think it's going to look, understanding that any forecast is going to be wrong. But at least it's certain amount of judgment that goes in, our best judgment on where we think it's headed. And let me just comment on the annual financial statements unaudited. I found the document very, very interesting because it covered things that I really had not thought about for a long time. It talked about such exciting topics as compensated absences and how we account for that. It talked about really our pension plans and our exposure there, the Washington City's insurance authority, what our exposure was there. It talked about our risk management. It talks about retiree health savings account, post-employment benefits. I mentioned risk management. So I found long-term debt. I found all of that very, very enlightening. I almost said interesting. Some of it was interesting, but it was it was very, because here is a snapshot, really, of the financial health of the city and all of the programs that place a financial obligation on our revenues. And so that's some good work.
Thank you. Our financial statements are really the story about what happened the previous year. Our goal was to get them out earlier, but because of some reconciliations and some cleanup of prior years, we were delayed by about 2 months. Our goal was to actually get it to the council by mid-April, but we just had some unplanned reconciliations that we had to do. So we'll be working towards that goal for next year.
Great. Okay, so drive on.
Drive on. Okay. So as I indicated earlier, are there, if you,
Page number again?
207?
Got it.
So of all the documents, when I was going through and reading them, I really felt like the top 10 list was a great place to begin having a discussion with the council about where do we want to go and what does the future look like that helps provide long-term fiscal sustainability to the community. And if you look at the first item on the top 10 list, and we'll be talking about it here in a little bit, is to establish a rainy day fund or a budget stabilization reserve. Many cities, what they do is they take some money often in the good years or one-time money that particularly that comes into the general fund, and what they typically do is begin setting that money aside for unplanned emergencies or unusual transactions that are coming up. Beth Ann will be talking about the contingency fund, as we call it in the state of Washington, and maybe making a proposal for council to consider a contingency fund. The nice thing about that is, and then there are some other opportunities to perhaps look at, for instance, like a building reserve fund. We have a number of buildings in the city, and if there is an opportunity in the good times when we have some excess money, it's always nice to build up a small reserve so that if a roof has to be replaced, we have the money set aside in order to maintain our existing assets. So there's a number of reserves. What you don't want to do is end up reserving all of your money, but there might be some key points or key operations that you would want to consider. The next item, number 2, is regular economic and revenue updates to identify shortfalls early. We're moving in that direction, and that we do quarterly updates that give you, for the current year, a snapshot of where we think there's variances, how we're doing, whether we're meeting our expectations, and are we on target. And then as we begin to develop the 5-year financial forecast, that too will then become a document that once we set up the foundation of it, it's easier to put in more what-if scenarios and modify it based upon information. You typically do not update the financial plan more than once a year because there's a lot of work that goes into it. Prioritize spending plans and establish contingency planning for operating budgets. We're beginning, as Bob alluded to it earlier, one of the things we want to do is get a better understanding, particularly in the general fund, what portion of the general fund is really discretionary spending that gives the council the opportunity to make some decisions, and what portion of it is really required. And then sort of looking at that and giving you a better understanding. One of the things that's really interesting is when you look at our overall, typically in a city, when you look at all of the revenue that comes in, probably between 15 to 20% is really council discretion on what you can really do with that money. The majority of that money is restricted for a particular purpose. Now that purpose, council has an opportunity, let's say lodging tax, for instance. That money can only be used to promote tourism, but the council has the opportunity to influence how that money is spent. But that tourism money cannot be spent on the water utility. Conversely, the water utility can't be used to do street repair. So overall, when you look at what we're managing, we're really managing on a day-to-day basis a small amount of discretionary money that can go for different things. So we'll be looking more at a prioritized spending plan and looking at and developing more in the way of contingency plans. Also in the contingency plan is looking longer term too. We have a number of retirements into the futures, and some of them are substantial payouts. Part of the contingency plan would be looking at a set aside in when we estimate when those years, those senior employees will be retiring, and setting up some reserves. So when the year comes, it isn't something where we're suddenly looking at our operating budget and trying to find a way to deal with an unplanned expenditure. The next one is a formalized capital improvement plan in order to assess future infrastructure requirements. The city does in fact have a capital improvement plan that is a 6-year plan, but one of the opportunities to improve it is it's not really a fiscally constrained document. It is really more of those projects that the staff has recommended for the council consideration in a whole gamut of different types of capital projects. What you really want to do is to get everybody on the same page to say, these are our priorities. Here's where we believe we can get the revenue, whether it's through grants, whether it's through restricted revenue, whether it's issuing debt. But we have about $600 million in capital improvement plans for this current 6-year period of time, and the reality is we'll probably maybe do about $40 million in that same period of time. Additionally, one of the pieces in there is really sitting down and educating council that when we take on substantial projects, what does it mean to the annual operation and maintenance of that facility once you bring it online? We're beginning to have discussions about Confluence Park. Very, very large park, wonderful development, great amenity, but at this point in time, there really hasn't been a discussion about what happens next year on the maintenance and operations side. So we really want to spend a little bit more time, or if you bring something online, you know, where I've worked before, we had a very large secondary sewer treatment plant. $1 million in electricity bills. And so those are the types of discussion is to advise you up front, here's the project, but here's the long-term financial need in order to support that asset. That will probably be done in stages. We're required to have a capital facilities plan. Typically, the council would have seen one by now, but what we have been doing is we've been making some minor changes to the look and the feel of it. We've been working with the departments. We probably will not get there 100% this year, but we'll get further along than the current document. Item number 5 is really having a discussion.
Excuse me. So, I'm gonna go, so we do have a 6-year look
Yes.
at capital, right? And,
Yes.
but you said, and it sounded like, if I may paraphrase, but that's the wish list. That's like everything we want to do. But I think you were explaining that the preferred, there's an alternative way of approaching that, and it's based upon feasibility?
Yes. It's really, what you have is the overarching umbrella is the city's comprehensive plan. It goes out 20 years, basically said, here are our capital needs. These are all the things that we would like. Then what you do is you begin having a funnel. The next funnel is the 6-year capital facilities plan. It then goes in and looks at the things that are on that 20-year horizon and say, in the next 6 years, what are the projects that we should be considering doing based upon different criteria? Maybe it's because we have grant funding. Maybe because we believe the infrastructure is failing. And so what you do is you try to narrow that 20-year into a 6-year. And ours, to use your word, is more of a wish list. And so we really need to work with both the departments and the council to say what is really realistic into the future. And it's a fluid document because we might have a project that we didn't consider in the 6-year capital facility plan, but maybe there's a grant opportunity out there for 90% financing with only a 10% match. Well, in that case, the document has to be flexible enough to accommodate those types of things.
So that adjustment, would that be just more changing practices, or is there a
Yes.
policy that would drive that?
It would just really be changing practices and looking at the criteria.
Thank you.
So the next item, right now
You
you'll,
know, on that topic, one of our goals was to take a longer look at our major capital projects. And so what I think I heard you say is we're going to begin to take that longer look and try to see and look at our financial capability and see how we can more effectively plan for providing the facilities when we need them.
correct.
Okay. And there will be some policy decisions that the council will have to make in order to implement that?
Absolutely.
Okay. And we will, and I believe that, was that a 2014 goal?
Some pieces will begin doing this
This
year.
year.
And some of the more significant pieces are in your utility operations. And that's really dependent on that rate revenue study, because the rate revenue study works at a highly technical level with the public works engineers to say, these are the planned projects that you want to do in the next 6 years. Now, it could be the case where staff recommends all these projects, and then the general facility charge goes up by 200%. And then part of the council policy discussion is to say, well, let's wait on this project, or let's see if, so the discussion comes in. The most significant discussion that I've seen in my career is generally in the utilities when you're looking at those capital projects.
Okay. Thank you.
And you do it every year when you look at the transportation improvement plan, too.
We do.
So it's pulling in those different documents into a summary document. Okay, number 6 is, we've had a little bit of a discussion talking about long-term planning for liabilities, including our pension obligation, other pension obligations besides our retirement system, looking at our contingent obligations, and looking at our budgetary risk. So we began looking at our budgetary risk by the 5-year financial plan. Many cities in the United States, we're in a better position compared to most cities in the United States, because the majority of our employees belong to the state of Washington, one of their components of their retirement system. So it's managed as a big umbrella. Only Seattle, Spokane, and Tacoma have their own retirement systems. So we have because it's such a large organization at the state level, they've been able to attract very sophisticated individuals that know how to manage pension system. In other cities around the United States, many of them self-manage it through a 401k or 401a. And so that in this most recent economic times, a lot of people's individual portfolios have decreased. With the state system, they too are looking out there 20, 30 years. So they're really in the investment mode for the long term, and they have a lot of actuarial studies to assist them in looking into that. So at this point in time, I think the majority of our state pension systems are fully funded. We have a couple of them that have some real challenges. Particularly during the recession, what happened, we're going to be seeing some significant increases in our pension contributions, because the state legislature several years ago, in order to balance their budget, they reduced the contribution rates both to the state employees and to all of the cities. That then decreases the amount of money available for investment. So their plan projection is to increase several percentage points over the next several years, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the financial plan, in order to start working on some of the expected unfunded liabilities. So we have some 6 employees that are left, 1 employee that we have a medical obligation for. So we're pretty much on a pay-as-you-go. So that is some exposure and risk that we need to look at down the road. If any of them were to go into a nursing home, we would have the obligation to fund that. Also, as I indicated, as part of the long-term financial planning is to look out for our senior employees who are leaving and setting some money aside for the payouts of their retirement. So it's really looking at those different pieces and pulling them into the financial plan and having the discussion with council so that you understand the things that are causing variances from year to year. A formal debt management policy in place. We have a lot of new pieces to our proposed policy that would talk about the different types of debt, relationships with Standard & Poor's and our rating agency. So we've added a lot more information in our standard policy. Another piece is to have a conversation of a pay-as-you-go financing strategy as part of the operating and capital budget. Here in the state of Washington, we are prohibited from issuing debt for day-to-day operations. You issue it for capital. And one of the important pieces here is sometimes, the ratings agency would like to see a pay-as-you-go because basically what you do is you have all of the savings from not issuing debt. In certain circumstances, if that project has value and future growth, then you may want to issue debt. But when you look at pay-as-you-go financing, it becomes all that more important to fund depreciation in your utilities because that becomes the source of revenue for future construction projects. So it's sort of one or the other. You sometimes can get away with not funding depreciation if you believe you're always going to issue revenue bonds. But if you don't really want to issue debt, then you very clearly need to fund depreciation. And part of it is when you issue debt, that in the years that you issue debt, it causes you to have to increase the rates in order to cover the debt. If you cover depreciation, you'll sometimes collect that money over 20 to 40 years. So it's really a policy discussion on where on that continuum do you want to be.
So how clear are our policies now in that area? Or is there good direction or any at all?
There's no direction at this point in time.
I remember talking about contingency
Yes.
funding last fall.
Yes, we began having the discussions when we held our budget meetings.
Okay.
Number 8, we're working on. We should have the first one rolled out to you in July. Effective management and information systems. We've been doing some work on this in the last several months. We've done an evaluation of our financial accounting system. We've had 2 consultants in who have taken a look at that system. There's very clearly lots of opportunity for improvement in our current system. We'll be bringing a recommendation forward to council to look at some alternatives. The other piece that is more important, just because of the changes in the world and technology, we're also in the process of, under the budget for 2013, we're doing an information technology assessment where we're really looking at the hardware and the software that supports the operations of the city. That report should be due in late August, early September, that would then give us an assessment of where we're at. But it also will be a 3-year strategic plan on where we should be going with our investments in technology. So those 2 pieces we're currently working on. And then the last one, a well-defined and coordinated economic development strategy. Through the 2013 and the 2014 goals, the council has also supported this as being an important priority, and I know that we're working on getting a consultant. The Economic Vitality Commission has been doing lots of work in this area to help define where we need to be going. So as you can see, we still have some opportunities to grow and to improve, but overall, of the 10 characteristics, we are making significant progress in moving forward in improving those areas and making it an overall better operation.
Let me ask you a question. So this is 1 one benchmark way of assessing our operations. How do you expect to use this going forward?
Overall, one of our goals is to do some improvements in this and then see if there's an opportunity to meet with a rating agency and see if we can get an upgrade to our general obligation debt. If in fact we can, we realize there's some significant savings in that. And it also becomes a benchmark as far as looking at a five-star city and, establishing the benchmark of we're doing good work. It's really difficult in looking at the financial statements to draw that assessment without going through all 75 pages.
So this is a question, frankly, council should ask the administration every year. I mean, before we even get into the budget development process, we ought to have a checklist like this that we can go through and we could show you, the rainy day fund. That's an actual policy, and we would go through, and when we construct the budget, we would anticipate that, having that cash set aside for that. We'll have regular financial projections. Each year, we'll probably do a workshop where we would go through the ongoing and rolling 5-year financial projections. So really, I think the key thing would be to build these 10 best practices into our business practices as a city.
So in the assessment, do we have an existing assessment of these 10 top practices?
No, they do not. As far as a self-evaluation?
Or, well, just from the rating agency? But this
Well,
really
we do.
isn't.
We do in a way, because if you go to Section D,
Starts on
220 and 221.
Okay.
We do have an assessment in the fact that we have a AA+ stable rating that was affirmed. The next and the only step we can go to is a AAA.
Yeah, and I meant kind of an assessment per those 10
Um,
measures or characteristics.
What we would do is we would come up with them and show how we're meeting those criteria and then work with them to say, this is where we are at. As a result, can we change our rating? But you can also use it internally as a measure.
So, for example, a well-defined coordinated economic development strategy. So a big part of this would be a strategy that the administration would develop and submit to council for review. Council would provide their input on it, either adopt it as part of that strategy. And we should have a sheet, available that anyone from the public or council could look at, which, for example, lists all of the economic incentives that we provide for potential businesses. So like if the multifamily tax exemption, if council decided to adopt that as a economic incentive to meet our affordable housing goals, that would be on a sheet that we'd have available for us. So some of these things are practices. Some of these things you could actually document on a piece of paper that anybody could come in and say, how do we measure up on those things? And I think what Diane was reporting out to you tonight was that some were further along in some of these than others. But I think these would be the goals. So if council adopted, a policy that says, we ought to build these 10 practices into our general financial practices and review, get a report on that on an annual basis before we start the budget. That would be part of, that would become part of our budget review every year.
And maybe taking that a little further, because I just realized one of the goals that the council voted on was to measure city services and report to our residents. What you can also do there is to develop different metrics, including these as metrics, and then report out in a report to the community, how are we doing on achieving the metrics? And a part of that is a discussion with administration and council on what are the metrics that are important to this community. There is a very long list of metrics, but it's really sitting down with the council and saying, what's important to you as the elected official in looking at this community and what are the measures that really reflect the values of this community. So you can also do that in an annual report, a dashboard, a performance measure report that says, here's our report card and this is how we are doing.
But I found that recently, in looking at levels of service, I mean, it's in the comp plan, at least as to capital, facilities. And I actually found the document because I was reading it a couple weeks ago. I don't know why, but I really
The
don't.
anticipation.
Yeah,
These documents, you're one.
but it talks about water, sewer, stormwater, fire, police, parks, transportation. Now, it doesn't go into every conceivable metric for those departments. It's really basic type of stuff, one officer per 876 calls for service. That's fairly detailed. Road capacity, vehicle, VPC. So, it goes into some level of detail. Are you talking about going into even more level of detail than what's in the comp plan, or just updating what we already have as our LOS?
Well, LOS is all of those are outputs. And a lot of times in your metrics, what you want is outcomes. So those are just outputs, and more communities are looking at, and it's a sense of feeling, how safe does the community feel? And if 80% of them feel safe, then you know that in general, you're achieving what's important to the community. But more and more, we're looking towards, one officer per 1,000 or 683. That doesn't really necessarily correlate to reduced crime. One might think it, but then it's sort of that chicken and egg. If you have more officers, do you have more crime? Because more crime is being reported. And so what we're trying to do is move more towards outcomes. But the comprehensive plan is a measure in order to accommodate growth, not necessarily community opinions or community values.
So, Stacy, go ahead.
So, the management characteristics number 10, the well-defined and coordinated economic development strategy. So how is this different from the economic vitality plan that we have?
So that is our overall economic development plan. It's been received by council, it wasn't adopted. But that's the first thing that if someone asks me, what do we have as a city, that I would point to as saying, here is our economic development plan. The second thing would be that the community has decided to make a real investment in the economic development sustainability area just by creating a department and staffing it at an appropriate level. And then the other piece of that is what other strategies do we have that are related there? So the economic development plan provides some broad-based areas of focus. For example, a university. So there's one of the things that, as we evaluated one of the needs in the community, we went out and attracted Bellevue College to come to the community, and there was a basis for that, and there was a relationship back to that economic development strategy.
So it would seem like, in our adopted budget for this year, we've listed the financial policies. We're having discussions around those now, and the council will be receiving around the 1st of October or so the proposed budget for 2014. So a lot of what we're talking about this evening and the review of our policies provides an opportunity to incorporate some of the things that you're already doing into our financial policies. And so this discussion this evening provides the opportunity to get a sensing of which of those policies should be changed or modified, and which new policies should be incorporated. And so you've presented 10 items and sort of provided a status report on work that is in process to begin to implement some of those 10 best practices that high-performing cities have implemented. So I think, just from the discussion and everything, that there's a general feeling that you're moving in the right direction, and these 10 things, while we haven't really studied them in a lot of detail, each of those seems to have merit, and some of those even have been suggestions from Paul has been talking about a contingency or a reserve fund, that was our last budget deliberations, as I recall. And there was some discussion around some of these 10 best practices at our goal-setting retreat as a direction that we wanted to, maybe not in the form and the words that are used in the Standard and Poor's description of these, but the general concept matches up really quite nicely. So I would imagine we haven't seen the last of these. Are there other questions or discussion on this part of the presentation?
Yeah, I would just ask that, so I'm at least really, I mean, this is new to me, these management characteristics. So they're still mostly words on paper. And if you, I'm just thinking about if you're going to continue to adopt these type characters or practices, systems, what have you, and the way that these characteristics, how are we going to get references back to these? How are we going? How are we as a council? I think this is what Fred was suggesting too. How are we as a council going to stay abreast?
Well,
Because there's the budget process, we have
Right.
policies, we're about to look at policies.
Yes.
Are we going to look at the policies in this type of framework? Or as relative to these, this one would fit within this characteristic, this one would fit in that characteristic?
Not all the policies are going to be a one-to-one match. This is not just, the 10 characteristics are not just the financial policies.
Mm-hmm.
They're the organization's operations. So, having economic development, having a good capital improvement plan. That's not just the finance department, it is the organization. So this is sort of the overarching, and then those pieces or components that relate to a financial policy, then we've tried to include that as a new or additional financial policy. Others mean perhaps a new document. Other means the 5-year financial plan. And so there's a policy that talks about that. So some of these are policies, and others, we already have existing documents. We just need to tweak them a little bit. So it's more philosophical.
Yeah, I understand that. And I'm just, and it kind of goes back to my earlier question about do we have the rating agencies kind of scores and assessment of how we're doing this? And you're shaking your head no. So, and it's in some of our heads and some of it in various documents where we are in some of these characteristics, but that's still coming together, and maybe you've decided how, or just still formulating in your own mind, how to, I'm not sure, I'm kind of searching for, is it reporting or actually ways to operate? This is one organization's list of top 10 management characteristics. There could be, the top 20 from somebody else, and they could be a little bit different.
Absolutely. We sort of started with the bigger picture of the rating agency because they're part of a report card, in my opinion, of how the city is doing. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the report card, what pieces go into giving you the score? So was it the test that you took daily? Was it the report that you did? Was it the extra credit? So those are sort of the bigger pictures that get you to the AA+. In general, the city is very, very, viewed positively by rating agencies. A AA+ is a very good rating. And some of it comes because of these policies that you already have in place. But there's an opportunity to stretch and even make the organization better financially and operationally.
Yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say, it's not only very good, it's an excellent rating. It's
Yeah.
not, if you had to use like a school analysis, it's not an A, but it's probably like an A-, in terms of a student. So a AA+ is an excellent rating. But I think what I would anticipate, and as we start to go through this, is every year before the mayor starts to develop the budget, that we would go through this general policy list. And so there would be some specifics, depending on what council wants to accomplish, because the mayor, when they put the budget together, will look to council policies to help provide guidance. And then there's a certain level of discretion that the mayor also has in developing the budget. So as we go through here, some of these things, the more detailed or more rigid some of the policies are, they take away from some of the discretion that the mayor has. So as we start to go through the general policies, for example, in this next section, one of the questions, and it would be like an addendum, would be, for example, on nonprofits. So what type of contribution should we make to the Arts Trust Fund on an annual basis? So right now, it's up to the mayor's discretion what that is that gets presented to council. If the council says we're going to have a minimum $100,000 contribution every year, that would be taking away from the mayor's discretion, because the mayor's going to meet that requirement. So where that starts to come in, I would think, before we start the budget process, and this would probably be mid-year, would be council would get the 5-year financial forecast, and you would get the long-term finances to see where things are. And then you would look at whatever these regular policies would be. And so there may be certain years based on the financial forecast where you may say, well, maybe we need to change the Arts Trust Fund contribution, or change whatever human services contributions there are. Maybe we need to change whatever we're funding for whatever policy it may be, or a capital contribution. So there's certain things that council on a regular basis, sales tax distribution. We have a certain percent that goes to general fund, certain percentage that goes to capital. Those are major items that council ought to look at on an annual basis, and provide that direction to the mayor before they start the budget. And it helps, I think what you'll see in your reviews then, the council review of the budget hitting October, it's kind of like going through the checklist and making sure, this is a council policy, and is it reflected in the budget or not? And it should make your review process, because you're pre-doing it, in a sense, a lot simpler and a lot faster.
So that's what we hope to accomplish. So we're talking about at this work session in July, we're really going to be discussing, well, we're going to look at them now, but really trying to narrow in on any additions or changes to the body of policies. And that would require some formal adoption in regular business at a regular council meeting, right?
Yep.
This has this been done? I mean, where did those existing policies come from? It was similar type of work process, or they just accumulate over the years? But I guess the reason I asked that question is because it feels like to me that, okay, this feels like the first time in a while this staff, a council, has gone through this kind of exercise. And this first year, it might be, there'll be a certain outcome. And then next year, continuing the same practice, we should perhaps have a better outcome, right? We'll get better at it. Mm-hmm. Is that your expectation? I mean, this is, because this, looking at budget policies in June, July, and prior to doing this, and then assessing how well you did when we see the budget later on, that's not been an existing practice. So we've got a little bit of a learning curve to go on.
And that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Now, maybe we've done this before. The 13 years that I've been on the council, I don't recall doing it before.
we've never formalized a process. We have, during budget discussions, we have added things that we want to be as a policy, but not formalized it to the point that the mayor every year can say, oh, that's right, the council. It's more like, well, last year, during the budget process, the council had this as a policy. But we've never actually sat down like this and said, okay, what are the policies we want? And had the administration be able to say, yes, this is a policy, this is a policy.
So I'm glad now the entire council is involved with this, and I can see how as we evolve as a governing body, I just wonder if in the future a actual finance committee may be a more effective way to fine-tune this as it becomes a more mature process. I'm just throwing that out there. We don't need to discuss it, but I know that's a pretty common practice, and as I think about, we're getting it at a certain level, eventually we'll be more familiar at a lower level in implementation, and I think that'll be more difficult for the committee of the whole to manage once we get
Typically,
more mature.
services and safety functions somewhat as our finance committee. That's the council committee that has the responsibility for things like this.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's perfect,
Yeah,
but we've started the conversation, and that's the important thing in my view.
Yeah. And I think, as you start to look at this, we do want to remember that, our outcome isn't that we go line by line through the budget, because council adopts budgets at the fund level versus a line item. So what the mayor really does is they'll take a look at general council policy, and then she should have the discretion to make changes to staffing, to operations, contracts, whatever the situation may be, based on the needs of the organization to accomplish whatever the goals are that council has adopted on a regular basis. So there should be some discretion. I think actually it's going to be one of the policy items here, that there is some discretion provided to the administration to make changes as needed. But we do want to make sure we keep that, kind of general focus as we go through here.
And I think one of my observations during the 2013 budget development process, I don't think when the budget was rolled out, everybody had the same common understanding, and there was a lot of conversation about what about this, what about that. And I think by everybody sort of reviewing the policies and getting that same foundation, we are hopeful that it might expedite the budget policy, because everybody will be working from the same framework.
Yeah, and our conversation should include many more references back to policy.
Stacy?
And these 10 characteristics, I would think would be part of some decision-making framework, not exactly as written all the time, but it seems like they should make their way into some sort of framework.
Yeah, and they're really guideposts. So, for example, if we've got some major capital projects, for example, if we've got a general debt policy for a debt policy, we may, there's a whole bunch of different ways to pay for those things. Interfund loans, you could issue GO debt, revenue bonds. Having something like this will enable us it starts to really focus in on what opportunities there are. And if there's an exception to the policy, at least we can come back to you and say, we really think this capital investment of this nature, it's a 30-year life, a debt issuance may be a better way to go in this situation than a, pay-as-you-go cash basis. It all depends. But at least, what it does is on those types of conversations, we're able to, see that and then kick that up to council for review if we see exceptions to, whatever policy there may be. So it really helps to drive that.
So on the 10 indicators, again, I'm a few steps behind here, just trying to process all this. It occurred to me that these were originally created, according to the article, in 2008, and they were updated in 2010. And, as we know, the financial circumstances of the whole country were very different in 2010, let alone 2008. I just want to make sure that, if we're looking at these as sort of the 10 commandments, if you will, of, financial policy direction, that they actually mirror the current state of where our city's at. So, you look at number 1 and it talks about rainy day budget stabilization reserve. And we've had discussions, I think, on this time and time again, on and off over the years, and it kind of comes up and it gets suggested, and then for different reasons it doesn't move forward. And I think the rationale that I had heard previously is because we have such a healthy coverage ratio, in terms of funds, that it wasn't really necessary based on our really good debt coverage ratio. But, if that becomes part of the policy, back in 2010, a rainy day fund might have looked really good because finances were in much more dire straits than they are today. I'm just trying to make sure that this document, the Standard & Poor's top 10 list, is the foundational underpinnings of where we want to go with policy. Or are there other studies out there? Are there more updated information?
So what I would suggest is that what I would suggest is what council should identify as a goal is what's our rating. So if we want to shoot for a AAA rating, then what this is saying is that AAA rating communities generally have these types of characteristics within them. So it's not just municipalities, but any standard business. You're going to see, businesses that understand what their marketing strategy is and their growth strategy. What lines are going to make future investment in and what lines are not going to make future investment in. Effective debt strategy for growth. So what I'm suggesting is on this, right now we're AA plus. There's only one more spot to go that may be higher. And what's in the metrics, which may influence that, it's in a different report here, but you'll see that is there are some real life implications. So if we went to, say, a 15 or a 20% cash reserve policy in general, that means, above the line, when we start the budget, the very first thing we do on the general fund is we take 20% of that general fund and set aside for cash before we even start talking about debt service or funding. So what that number is becomes very important, Well, debt service, actually, yeah. And then, and then that cash fund balance. Yeah.
And
But I was just going to say, but once the metrics are all put together, then it's a matter of looking at it every year and adjusting it. So it isn't,
Right.
it isn't a matter of, we make a policy today that our rainy day fund is going to be 15%. It is, we have to start someplace, but every year we sit down and look at the rainy day fund and say, oh, is that where we want it?
Exactly.
We look at the economics and say, is this where we want it? So it isn't so much that we're setting these as policy, we're using these as guidelines to look at specifically every year to say, okay, where are we now and where do we want to be?
Well put.
The other piece that's going to be important, and it's like if you had to do phase 1 and then phase 2, one is developing these policies, then the second one, which council's adopted as a goal, is what's the outcomes? So how effective are we really spending our money? And so even though it's not within the financial policies, I think at some point, as council has identified it as a goal, we need to be able to report back out to you how effective are we at having a safe community, if that's a goal of what that is, and it starts to define that. So a little bit better than what we see in the comp plan, but what is a safe community? Are we measuring that? That could be regular public safety surveys on a regular basis that will help us define what that starts to look like. And then maybe that gets incorporated in an annual report back to the community in some fashion. So we talked about that transparency back to our residents as a whole, and that's a way to start to do that. But I think if we get the financial policies in place first, we can continue to work on what the outcome measures start to look like and whether we're achieving, from a qualitative and quality perspective, what we're actually intending to do with the money that we're spending.
Can we take a few minute break?
Why don't, what's next, Diane?
maybe we can just do in a couple of minutes the Standard & Poor's report, and then we can then take a break.
Move into E.
Okay.
The policies
Take a
part.
break and move into E.
Or
So, if I could just, on page 220 to 221, this is the report that I worked with the rating agency in late April and May as far as updating our bond rating. And as you can see, they affirmed our AA plus stable. Just a little thing on page 200 and, well, on page 220, there's a paragraph that says Issaquah serves an estimated population of 20,377 people. So I talked to the rating agency today because at first I thought, well, not significant, but it becomes significant when we get over to the next page because that population drives a number of per capita numbers. So when I spoke to her today, she was going to be reissuing her report because what they do, they don't send me a draft, they just send me the final report. So what that happens is if we go over to the start of the full second paragraph on page 221, it says, we consider the city's overall net burden to be high on a per capita basis at $7,921. So when I was speaking to her and explaining that they used the incorrect population, that number went down to $5,304, which is in a more traditional range. So because I was looking at some other cities' ratings around us, and this is primarily due to the school district and their debt. So when you take our debt and their debt, and they say the debt combined, when you look at the community, they are saying it is high. So when I was looking at some surrounding cities, that wasn't in their analysis, and that's what caused me to try to back into that number. So we are in a more normal, acceptable range. So once I get an updated report, I will send it back out to the council.
Is that information part of the Kwahani PAA study? What adding 10,000+ people would do to that sort of per capita number?
I would suspect that it is not included because it doesn't consider the city's bond rating, but if we were to go out and get an update, it would naturally reduce it. Because you would take our fixed debt and spread it over a greater population.
And then the school district's debt is already incorporated in that general area, so that would essentially be the same.
So is there no fixed debt that would be assumed in the neighborhood? It just takes existing debt and adds a whole bunch of people?
The current proposal, yes, well, there might be some short-term interim financing because if you recall, there's that 5-year plan to do some infrastructure and capital equipment purchases, and the money won't be received for 10 years. So you'd have to just do some short-term, and you could even do internal financing at a modest rate. So it's just a short-term versus a long-term.
Other questions on this?
When you're talking about changing the population, it's to our current population, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, why don't we take a 5-minute break? We are in recess and we'll return in 5 minutes.
Stay on. I guess so.
So we are back in session after a short break, and are you ready to go, Diane?
I am. This is the last section for tonight. So we wanted to walk you through these proposed comprehensive financial and budget policies. It begins on page 227. And I don't know if the best way, and then on page 237 are the existing policies. And it was, as I indicated a little earlier, trying to do an exact crosswalk when you're sort of rewriting an entire section was a little difficult, but I tried to give you as much information on what I did with what's in the existing policy or how I treated it. There are several things in our current policy that are really direction from administration to departments. Some of them are administrative policy versus council policies. And particularly in the capital section, there are the criteria really is for the evaluation process of a capital project really belongs in the capital facility plan. It really isn't so much a council policy, but a direction for evaluating the projects.
So Diane, just real quick before you go on, I just want to get a general sense of where is this, the policy document? Is it just page 1 of the budget each year? Is it in the comp plan? Where do we find this?
You find it in the budget.
So it's in page 1 of the, or somewhere, page
Actually,
something.
it's section 2-32,
Okay.
financial policies.
So when we
And-
adopt our yearly budget, we are essentially also adopting the policies that came with the budget.
Well, in doing some research, it looked through a resolution done. You adopted some financial policies in 2002 through vis-a-vis a resolution. So the real question is, how much of a comprehensive look did you have at that time on the policy? But typically what you see is the council adopts the actual financial policies through legislative action. And then it just finds its home
Okay.
in the budget document.
So I would think the answer to your question is, no, we're not re-adopting the policies every year. It's actually fund level balance, that's all that we're adopting. And these are just part of the document as a guide for our deliberations.
But the policy drive the development of the budget.
Of course,
Yeah.
I'm saying, but we're not re-adopting them every year. I think
No.
that's
Okay.
your question.
Okay. That's what I just wanted,
Okay.
broad
Thank
overview.
you.
Thank you.
So really, one of the things is about financial policies, just in general operations. A consultant I once worked with said all roads lead to the general ledger. It's pretty much about, in order to do pretty much anything in government, you need to have the financial resources to accomplish whatever the goals are. So the policies become an important embodiment of the organization. So we just do an introductory comment talking about how we are accountable to the citizens for the use of the public dollars. It becomes very important to develop whatever documents in a manner that people can understand. And so the policies then become that driver in developing the budget.
Excuse me, Diane, before you go further, so you said it yourself, you took the liberty of looking at our existing policy, and you put out a new document.
Yes.
And I'm looking at the old one, and you've got, I appreciate those embedded comments. It gives us some sense of what you thought about this or what you did with that. But what was your what kind of guidance? What was your objective or goal, or what kind of guidance did you use when you rewrote this? You sat down. How did you know what form, outline, flow? That's not easy to do, to take something and just rewrite it. You must have had some end game in mind.
Lots of wisdom and experience.
Uh-huh.
A lot of it comes from being in this business a long time and trying to, understand what's important to the community and the council. So a lot of this is things like transparency, a clear communications device, making sure that what's included in this document are really subject matter related at the policy level for the city council. As I stated earlier, to me, there are things that are really directions from the mayor to the staff or their administrative policy and procedures versus council direction.
And the old document, the existing document, I should say,
Had-
has those are blended.
Yes.
They're,
Yeah,
okay.
yes. And so part of it is, one of the things is there is GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association. They have lots of examples, lots of guidances on what best practices are, what things you should consider in best policies. Part of it is looking at the city of Issaquah and what's important and trying to understand the culture and what your values are and trying to put those into the document. You know, for instance, Councilmember Butler talked about one city had a fund balance policy of 8%. What I have heard in my time with this council, that you would like a little larger fund balance to protect against unknowns and the future. So I tried to take into consideration what I understand to be some of the dynamics of the community. So it's a combination of looking at best practices, looking at what the recommendations are there. We actually, our profession has guidance, not the actual policies. You have to write those yourself on what components should be in a best practice policy.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at one here, it says more appropriate in the capital improvement plan document. So
Yeah.
you,
Pull that whole section out and you'll see it in another
okay,
document.
so thanks for that. I interrupted you, so thank you for that.
Okay, so starting with budget and contingency policy, you know, the budget provides two separate important purposes. First, it provides a level of public control of city spending through the required adoption by you as the elected representatives. And also it creates appropriations at the fund and at the detail level for the city administration to run the day-to-day operations. So part of it is public policy statement, and then there is the detail that we use on a day-to-day level to manage. Typically, how I've explained it is council manages at the fund level. The mayor operates at the department division level, and we typically allow department directors to have some flexibility within their line items. In general, what we don't give them flexibility on is salaries and benefits and being able to move them down for, you know, buying furniture and equipment. That becomes a conversation that we have at the administration level. But if you want to buy a monitor instead of buying more paper, then the department director has some discretion in exceeding line items. Anything significant, then they need to check in with me as the budget director and the administration to make sure that we're all in agreement philosophically where we're going. So when we adopt the budget, going on to page 228, the first general policy is that the budget would be adopted at the fund level. A very important policy is that ongoing expenditures should be funded by ongoing revenues. What you really don't want there is you really want to understand your revenue stream to figure out what is one-time money versus ongoing revenue, so that you don't fund a new program and then have to deal with a shortfall in future period. One of the things is we should have some contingency funding for unseen emergencies, and one way would be through a specific contingency fund. And we provided you some information in your handout, and Beth Ann, do you want to take that one?
On page 6 of the handout, page 6 is a summary chart. We gave some comparatives on the reserves and contingency funds of other jurisdictions.
That's down
Oh, that's, oh, sorry.
there. Let me give you the
Okay.
contingency fund,
Okay,
page 9.
page 9.
I got them out of order, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Is your mic on? Is her mic?
Yeah, I think it is. Okay, the contingency fund on page 9, now that I'm catching up. According to Washington state law, the city may create and maintain a contingency fund for monies for emergencies described in RCW 35A, 33080, and 090. And I kind of did the RCWs down below, and they're really for emergencies, some that are, everybody agrees on, or if there's an emergency in the community that was not foreseen, council can declare that and use the money for those, that declared emergency. The total amount allowed to accumulate in the contingency fund per RCW, it shall not exceed the equivalent of 37.5 cents per thousand assessed value of property within the city. I put City of Issaquah's December 31st, 2012 assessed valuation amount, and if you do the calculation, it would be approximately $2,158,334 that would be allowed to accumulate as a contingency fund under this RCW. So that's our contingency fund that you're allowed to do. It's kind of the rainy day fund.
So one of the things that Bob and I was talking about earlier in this contingency fund or the rainy day fund is if we had a bridge collapse, could we use this funding source to repair it? And if you look at non-debatable emergency preservation of order or public health, or for a property which has damaged or destroyed by accident. So this would be a source of revenue to help offset a very large emergency. And then you can use it for other emergencies if the entire council is in agreement with it. In some communities, you can, as you are aware, under state law, that is sort of the minimum foundation. In one community, when I worked with elected officials in establishing a contingency fund, what they wanted was that it had to be a supermajority approving the expenditure of the funds out of the emergency fund. So they had +1 on that. That is an option that is available in order, because the rainy day fund is what you really don't want to draw down unless it's really needed. And at that time, that body of elected officials wanted to make sure that the significant majority of them were in agreement. So there are, this is the minimum, and you can always make it more restrictive. And what it also does is it kind of does a little bit more of a balancing in the unreserved fund balance in the general fund. So it gets it more in alignment, because when you look at, maybe we'll jump a little bit ahead, if you go back to page 6 at the bottom, you'll see that there are a number of cities in the surrounding area that have reserves. And so Beth Ann did all the research on all of this for me.
No.
You want to take it on?
Oh,
We have a reserve.
so now we're
policy.
jumping back to,
That's a side question, I'm sorry.
So we have one of these funds? is what-
We do not.
we do
Okay.
A
not.
contingency.
Right, that's what I.
That you meant to
yeah.
reserve.
Okay.
So that
That's
is,
what I was getting at.
yeah, I think one of the, as we get through here, I think one of the questions for council would be, do we want to do this or not? So would you include this point or not? And then the second thing is, how are you able to spend the money that's in the contingency fund, which is the other piece? So for example, and this is an easy one for me, like in my last city, we had a hurricane, which is surprising in Cincinnati, but we came through, we had a lot of devastation in terms of trees. And council had delegated the authority to me to spend up to $500,000, waive all bidding requirements, and enter to whatever contracts needed to be done. And I had a contingency fund that I could tap into that. So, for example, I acquired a tub grinder, which is about $120,000 to rent per month, fairly significant. So in this case, if the mayor decided to declare an emergency, and we may define what that is or isn't, then what types of funding authority would she be able to, what are her powers? And some of that is laid out in our emergency powers ordinance. And then there may be a certain cap, so example, I had to go back to my council within 48 hours and report out what the emergency was, the status, and what expenditures I spent in that, during that intervening period. This would provide that. So if you decide to do it, A, then you should also, then the secondary piece of that, which would be kind of an addendum, would be, are there any stipulations on the use of that contingency fund that council wants, and what's the requirements that would be incorporated in that?
Beyond the state law, you mean?
So the state law identifies, but there's some, what that does is identify some general categories, but then the question is the mechanisms of how that gets
Okay.
reported.
So you can establish a contingency fund, but once you establish it, you can't just dip in. I mean, it's a set, there are restrictions on it once you
Yes.
establish.
Yes.
It's
Just
definitely
making
your
that
rainy
clear.
day fund.
Yeah.
It appears that you could actually, I'm looking at the RCW as we're talking about it, and I'm just reading it, and it talks about withdrawals from the contingency fund, which appears to be in a non-emergency situation. And there's an RCW that indicates that if you had the entire legislative body majority vote, you could actually withdraw and transfer to an appropriate operating fund by resolution or ordinance, as long as you state the facts constituting the reason for the withdrawal or the emergency, as the case may be. So it's not completely untouchable the way I read it,
Right.
but it's pretty restricted.
Right.
It's really about the council having the debate about, is this really the best use of the funds?
And I would also add to that, how do you establish, how does it get funded? That would,
So that's the question, that's a policy question. So you may come back and say, okay, we want to set up this fund, and then we're going to fund it to that level over 4 years.
Right.
Or it may just be, if you come back and say, all right, we're going to have a general fund policy of 10% for carryover in our general fund, undesignated balance. That's going to free up, because our balances are over 25% right now, some cash that if you chose to, you could one time put it in there and it's taken care of. So you got some flexibility in terms of how that gets funded.
Diane, as we go through this as well.
Go ahead.
So your draft, some of it is new and some of it is a reconstitution of the old. Like that could be would it be possible for you to,
I can try.
would it be possible for you to, okay, so I can tell you're just loving that idea.
I had fun with the other one, trying to figure out where
I'm
I
sure.
took it from one point to another, but I can try.
And maybe just at a section level.
Yeah.
I mean, because we've already discussed, like, we do not have a contingency fund policy, right?
Right.
So this would be new,
Yes.
So that's,
Yeah. Oh, and some of them I know, like the first one is existing, just rewritten. Second one's existing, just rewritten. Third one is new
there you go.
on the contingency fund.
Maybe as we go through it, you can
Yeah,
just mention that.
to those that I can remember the best.
Okay.
Utility operations, the next one is just a clarification. It's indicating that we should show positive net operating results. And then utilities, because it's a standalone business, should be responsible for the cost of operations, including indirect costs, or full costing. One of the approaches that we have been working on is the way our current accounting structure is set up. We really don't always, in all of our funds, know the full cost of operations. And so, to that end, one of the council approved in the 2013 budget to work with a consultant to develop a cost allocation plan. And what that would then do is we would bring it back to the council and say, of these indirect costs, this percentage is attributable to these individual funds. For instance,
Human resources is an easy one, right?
yeah, but looking at human resources, we generally have employees that are charged to all of our funds, but we never charge any portion of our human resources cost to that department, to that fund. If you were a business, that would be a cost of doing business. Now, we're sort of jumping ahead to when we bring the report back, but like our lodging tax fund, we have Andrea that works in there, and there is a certain amount of administrative costs, whether it's finance processing, accounts payable, or developing their budget, or hiring people, or economic development, working with those folks. In some of those funds, it might be the conversation where council says, this is such an important operation, we want to subsidize the indirect costs to that fund, and we'll show the accounting for it. But typically, utilities, they pay for their full cost, as does like equipment rental and some of our other things. So we'll be bringing back full costing. You know, one of the things you'll see for 2014 in the budget will be our insurance costs. We'll give the departments the money, but we'll also begin showing what their portion or their cost of our overall insurance bill is. Our insurance bill is $600,000, and when the council sort of pays it, we've never really had a discussion about it. We never have a discussion about where those costs incurred in relation to our insurance. So we're going to be moving slowly towards full costing, but we won't go all the way to the end of the continuum.
So we sort of jumped onto that topic, and I wanted to just back up on the contingency fund for a second, so we just kind of went right along.
Okay.
And I'm still on, remember I'm a step behind tonight. Can we just flag that particular fund issue? I don't know if we're going to talk about it next time, but I don't really know enough about the pros and cons of having a rainy day fund. And it could be helpful to just get, because I'm sitting here really struggling with, why do we need it? And then I'm sort of thinking, well, it sounds really good. And then well, why do we need it? So I don't know enough information, and I don't want to debate and discuss it tonight because I don't have any information in front of me other than the statute. But if that's something that we're going to talk about next time, or
Yes.
okay,
Next, I think, so tonight we're kind of introducing the concepts, and so then, eventually what I would anticipate out of this is an agenda bill that council then would go ahead and adopt. So next time, some of these things, for example, not just the contingency one, but the utility operations, we'll get, when that full cost accounting report comes out and you come back and it might be like, you have to do a 35% increase in the water utility fund, you may say, okay, we're going to amend this to say within 5 years, we're going to achieve full cost recovery. So, but I think the intent is to get umbrella policies, and this is a good question. This is a yes or no, and then if it ends up being yes, then there's some criterion below that you're going to have to. So I almost see some addendums or,
I'm just looking for
within
pros,
that.
cons kind of thing, right? Just something that I can look at and go, let me weigh these considerations against the other to help me determine if this on the list here is worth pursuing.
Yeah, and a good example of that would be, for example, if the bridge over the creek on Front Street collapsed. So that's something that we'd have to do right away. So you could either, there's a few ways to do it. One is you could have a contingency fund. The mayor would have the authority to go ahead and get that fixed. The second one would be to go ahead and get that fixed, start obligating some contracts. But then, you don't have authority within the budget to spend that money. So what you're really relying upon is the council to come back and then amend, when they do a budget amendment, amend the budget to reflect that expenditure because it's not accounted for anywhere. And so the problem that you get into is, what if council doesn't amend the budget to allow that expenditure authority? Then you've got the administration's got a problem there because it doesn't meet, because when the auditor comes in, he'll come back and he'll look at what's been appropriated on the fund level and not. So that's some of the discussion. Like if you want some more information, we could do we're running on top 10 lists, I guess, today. So we could do a top 10 list of why, yes or no, why it would make some good sense to do that. What are the costs and benefits of that?
Yeah, just both sides of the issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Be helpful.
So we've talked about utility operation. Go ahead.
And we spent a lot of time earlier talking about the preparation of the 5-year for financial forecast for the general fund. And basically what you do is you just look at the level of services that you're providing today and forecast that out into the future.
That would be a new policy.
Yes. Use of fund balance to balance the budget, that would be new. This is really more about transparency and making it very clear when you're using fund balance in order to balance ongoing operations. Number 7, restricted revenues. I think there might be I think that is addressed in here. It is basically saying that restricted revenues shall only be used for those purposes consistent with whatever legal restrictions were placed upon them, whether it's state law, whether it is maybe a grant entitlement or city council ordinance. So it's basically indicating we can't use restricted revenue for any other purpose than that for which it is designated.
Diane, why would we need a policy for that?
That's what I'm
Follow
wondering.
the law.
I think it's really, it's
Or
just like, it's a best practice, yeah, it's transparency, right. Well, or council direction. I mean, that's not, well, I guess if it's an ordinance, it would be, the law. But there may be some practices or whatever that have been done related to that.
So I'm a step behind. The 5-year forecast, I'm sorry, I just want to go back 1 second. When we do our annual budgeting or annual budget process, we have long gotten information about the current year, the previous year, and the previous year before that. And I think that's all we've gotten, at least since I've been doing this. Are we looking at expanding on that information in any way? Because I've usually had to go back and peel out my, 09 budget or 08 budget to really see the trend lines beyond just the last 3 years. Is there any consideration for this year's budget in saving me a few hours one evening of doing that, or are we still looking at that 3-year window?
So the typical, what you get out of this, what you just mentioned, that's standard in every organization or every city. So you usually get the previous year's actuals, where you are on the appropriate budget. You may have a current projection in terms of year to date, and then the next year's budget. So just from from the mechanics of being able to incorporate that into a budget document is somewhat challenging too. There's only so much space. And the other thing is how you compare things. So if you're looking at items on a line-by-line basis, which it may not always be true on a line basis. So if you're really looking at things and that's where I think you run into some of the challenges from time to time is, well, why was this line item at this year? And so, like an example would be HR has a certain amount of contract money they put into their budget. And so they anticipate, well, there may be 3 investigations this year and there may be a certain amount of training. And they get to year end and it's like, well, we had no investigations. So, that money may get transferred somewhere else or it may just end up getting carried over into the next year. So when you look at the actual versus appropriated, if you didn't end up using that money, what was appropriated, because you're appropriating conservatively, you're going to see some variances. So that's why on a line-by-line basis, it's really difficult to project it over a 4 or 5 year basis.
But those
because of those
aberrations,
variances.
the aberrations would be easier to spot, in my opinion, if you actually had a longer term. Because one of the problems we've gotten into is we look at the 3-year and we go, okay, last year this was really high or this was really low. And then, you explain it very easily as you just did. But if you had prior year data, you could see, oh, actually this department for, consultants or other expenses or whatever category you pick has actually maintained $30,000, but this one year because of your explanation. And so, having that sort of data, I don't want to debate the point in detail at the moment, but it's just, if it requires adding an extra couple sheets to the budget, it's pretty helpful information to have. I mean, if it's not in there, I suppose we can each individually go back and peel out our old budgets, but, it talks about 5-year forecast, and it seems like 5-year, in my mind, means 5-year, but maybe I'm looking at something.
Going forward.
It's prospective.
Forward-looking and
Oh, okay, I interpreted rolling as sort of a range. But it's only prospective.
Well, I typically pick up the last 3, and then I give you the next 5, plus the current budget, so like 9?
It says 5-year forecast, so that's,
It's
to me, that was all
prospective.
forward-looking.
Okay.
It's, because the budget is really about where we're going, not where we've been. It's trying to understand, here is our level of service, this is what it costs to fund it. So if we maintain that current level of service, what things are going, do we need to be aware of into the future? And here's just a small example. It doesn't, in the past, like, under the new healthcare, starting this year, we have to pay $63 a person to the federal government. Well, so you're gonna see a blip in everybody's personnel benefit line items based upon the number of FTEs. And then we're gonna be increasing, PERS contribution, and then we're gonna be increasing, the Social Security lit. So when you look at the past, it's going to be maybe spiking higher than in the past. So it's really about where are we going and continuing to provide the same level of service, and what does it cost us?
Okay, why don't we move on?
Okay, accrued employee benefits, we spoke a little bit about this earlier. The budget as well as the long-range financial plan shall provide for adequate funding of the city's retirement liabilities. The old policy had the budget, but it wasn't I spelled it out to also include the long-range financial plan.
I just wanted to make a comment back on 7, I'm sorry. It's in there also because it's a reminder there are some cities that have gotten in trouble before by using utility revenues to help fund the general fund. So it's just from a policy perspective, it's just good to highlight it, as you said, from yeah. So that's the reason why it's in there.
Nonprofit organization, that's in the existing policy. It says future funding decisions regarding nonprofits will be based on guidelines, policies, priorities determined by the city council, and then funding as it's based, as it's available. Bob and I had some conversations about trying to put a dollar limit into that, but in economic recessions, if that becomes a council goal with a specific dollar amount, that might force other business decisions that you wouldn't want. So this is the opportunity just to revisit it, to say, here is our threshold and our commitment to the nonprofit organizations.
So there was a percentage that we had talked about last year.
Per capita.
Either per capita, well, that was the funding for the human services. But for the organizations, there was a policy question about whether the city would fund 50% or more of the operating budget of a particular organization. And there were some of us that seemed to feel we should go in that direction. I don't think we formally adopted anything in that regard. It was, that level was used in our decision-making, with a couple of the organizations that we funded. But I still think it's on the table as a policy question for this year's budget, whether, not dollar number, but percentage-wise, whether we would want to establish a certain cutoff for funding those organizations. What I think Paul was talking about was the per capita funding for the miscellaneous contributions to the huge 2-page list of human services organizations where the mayor had a goal. We didn't quite agree. We came up with a number. That was another policy issue also that's still on the table, I suppose.
So these are, the way that I would suggest this is handled is you do, and it says that you almost have like an addendum, that that spells out those policies. And so when council at a workshop in the future, on an annual basis, they may come through, they'll look at the 5-year financial forecast, they'll look at, what's anticipated for this next year. And then one of the policies they look at is, okay, this is our funding on nonprofit, human services organizations. It's $10 per capita. This year, we may not have, our expected revenues, so this year we may want to reduce that to $8 per capita. But at least on a regular basis, at the front end of the budget, we can get that clarification. So your point's well taken. If that was I would anticipate seeing something like that in there, because that would limit that. So the other things in here are, the Arts Fund, the LTAC, other types of organizations that get funded by the city on a regular basis. What's overall policies or goals? Some of these don't always, and again, talking about outcomes, like for example, the arts. In the past, we get a recommendation from the Arts Commission, comes through the mayor to council. We haven't really had an opportunity to discuss, is the spending really achieving what we want it to achieve? Or not? Is there any other guidance that we want to provide to the mayor and the commission before those, at the front end, before they start to make individual decisions on the organizations that they choose to fund? So there's opportunities there to do that too.
So you're flagging both of those, the per capita and the 50% of operating budget for nonprofits.
Yeah, we have that. So I think what we'll do is we'll have a kind of a list that we'll give you. We'll draft that addenda, and then at our next workshop session on this, you'll be able to go through and say, I like this, don't like it, modify, whatever that may be.
It'll just go into this existing document?
It would be kind of, it would be, so I almost see like in exhibits. So you have this, and then the exhibits are those things that, what you want to do is get the umbrella, and that's kind of more static. And then the exhibits are ones that council would look at on a regular or annualized basis and say, does it make sense for this upcoming year or not? And do that at the front end of the budget process, and it gives some discretion it gives some guidance to the mayor in terms of putting the overall budget together.
Okay, number 10, budget monitoring. I believe it's included in a more general sense in the current policies. We just rewrote it to be more clear about trying to improve the accuracy of revenue and expenditure forecasting, and clearly looking at the variances. Council planning, the city council will meet annually to discuss council goals and priorities for the start of the upcoming budget process. That is an existing policy. Under cash management and investment policies, this section was rewritten. It talks about a little bit more of an introduction about being our responsibility and our fiduciary responsibilities to be careful and manage the financial control of the city's daily operations. And it just reaffirms that we can only invest in those instruments that are allowable by state law, but we didn't cite the specific law, but we make reference that we have to follow state law when doing our investments. Some other things just more to clarify is all cash received by the city will be deposited with the finance director on the same day as required by state law. There's a law that says you have 24 hours to deposit your funds. So the departments typically, just as an aside, they bring their money into us on a daily basis, and then we deposit their funds to the bank from there. The city shall maintain a cash management program, which includes the collection of accounts receivables and the disbursement of funds, and the prudent investment of its available cash. And then it just talks, and then the last section is about maximizing the return consistent with the primary objectives. We call this pretty much the prudent man rule, in that we will not, there's a lot of things that government is not allowed to invest in because it is speculative. We can invest in stocks We can't invest in mutual funds because there's just too much volatility, and our primary objective is preserving principal. Reserve and fund policies, the general fund reserve policy in the existing one was 8%. Let's see, I'm trying to remember where that section is at.
238.
So we maintain the 8% of operating expenditures, but because of the council conversations that I've been listening to, it says we've also included best practices is to maintain a maximum of 15% or a 2-month reserve. We added that no use of ending fund balance below 8% shall be authorized without a vote of the majority plus one, so that the entire council is on the understanding that if we had to draw down below 8%, that the entire council fully understood it. Then what we did was we added a utility fund reserves or working capital. For the water and sewer utilities, we're recommending a 2-month cash, not a case reserve, but a cash reserve. And then for the stormwater utility, because it doesn't have as much volatility, we're recommending 8% of budgeted expenses.
So since we talked earlier about the ways in which those utility funds can be funded, essentially rates or contributions in, right, if I understood that answer, right? So if by establishing a policy that has an 8 or 15%, what is the implication for either of those? In other words, based on where we stand, those funds being so close to revenues versus expenses right now, or even in one case below, is this the existing or is this the proposed policy?
Currently, we have no policy, so this is a proposed policy.
So I guess I'm interested in finding out, not for tonight necessarily, unless it's an instant answer, but what does this mean? Like, what does 8 or 15% translate to? Is it, that we would have to raise rates to a certain level to get that cushion? Or do we have to put X amount of dollars in from the general fund to get to that cushion? Or, how do you get there as a policy?
Currently, on a month-to-month basis, your utilities have easily sufficient cash on hand to meet these reserves. If in the event you had a catastrophic or a unique event that would require you to, if that dollar amount started to get lower than what we're currently managing, it really would not require a rate increase or funding from the general fund. What that means is you would use some money that you normally would have used for capital projects. You would delay those capital projects until such time as the cash was sufficient to meet that goal.
So we're okay right now. We would have these cushions. We wouldn't have to raise rates to get
No.
to these cushions?
No,
Okay.
you are fine.
That's what I was getting at.
Because now what we do, it's inherent. What we do is we look at the utilities and the operating funds and the cash so that the rates are sufficient enough to cover depreciation. And then we look at our capital needs when we're doing the budget development and say, okay, this is what we need for operation, and the excess can go in for capital projects. So inherently, we're already planning and managing that way. We're just formalizing it through a policy.
Thank you. That's great.
I have another question. Then is that? That's okay. Sorry. So, 2-month case reserves, and this would
As a
be.
cash reserve.
I can't believe I read it. Yep.
Spell check didn't get it.
Case is spelled perfectly. Okay, and that's 15% of what? It says a budget, 15% where? Is it, I'm looking at, like, our statements, like, I'm looking at the water operations one for now. Where would those, how would that be computed based upon the lines?
It would be the line of operations and maintenance. It would not be depreciation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So there's the expense. Okay, so,
15% of that.
So,
and it would be where in this report?
right here. So if you looked at, say, the stormwater fund,
Of expenses, that's revenue.
based on revenue,
So maintenance and operations, stormwater, 2012, 3294.
3294 would
94.
be 15% of that.
Yeah.
And that would show up where in here?
Well,
It-
and-
In the balance sheet.
Yeah.
It doesn't show up in here.
No.
It'd be in the balance sheet, and would that be, I mean, is that, because the bottom line here is total net assets.
Yes.
I mean, not all, and so it's, is it reflected in the total value of the assets?
What we would do is ensure that there's sufficient cash,
Cash?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the two.
that there's enough reserves to manage the day-to-day operations for at least 2 months, if in the event,
So this is a yearly statement, there's the balance sheet, which tells
Yeah.
me what cash I have on hand.
Yes.
and have money.
Exactly.
correct,
Okay.
okay. We thought the balance sheet gets a little complex to explain.
But it's what you have in your account.
Yeah. And what we do is, once we know these policies are in place, at the end of the year, we sit down with these and say, okay, how did we do? Did we meet this goal? Did we achieve this? We check throughout the year, but at the end of the year, we actually do a series of different calculations.
Great. Thank you.
Fleet management, there was an existing policy, but I rewrote it to look at the funding requirement. I think it was based upon the historical cost of the asset. I replaced it to say the life cycle cost to replace the asset. So what that basically does is it takes into account inflation or any other increases in cost. So if you hold on to, like a police vehicle, years ago, not too long ago, you could buy one for $30,000. Now your base cost is $50,000 plus all of the equipment. So when a vehicle comes out of service, we want to have enough money to get it back to its original condition. So that means often at times funding more than the historical cost. Revenue policy, the majority of these are all, I think most of these are in here. We will avoid dependence on temporary or unstable revenues to fund basic municipal services. We will actively pursue our fair share of state and federal funding. The city will actively oppose state and federal legislation that basically institutes unfunded mandates. We will work diligently to collect all of our revenues due and ensure compliance with the revenue-related regulations. The next one on user fees. The city will consider user fees when the character of the service and its users seems appropriate. If user fees are charged, the user fee will be structured to recover the full cost of the service, including all direct, capital, department overhead, and citywide overhead. However, full cost recovery may not be implemented if the fee prevents an individual from obtaining an essential service or results in the city being economically disadvantaged or as otherwise set by the city council. So it basically says our goal is for 100% cost recovery for those fees. However, there may fees that we charge that we do not want to do 100% cost recovery. It might be like a program in our rec program for disadvantaged children. We may choose to subsidize that program with sales tax and property taxes. But there's enough flexibility, but the general direction is 100% cost recovery.
Is this an existing policy?
Parts of it. I rewrote particularly the last sentence. Full cost recovery.
And the economic disadvantage one, so we may come back and determine full cost recovery, and our building permit fees may end up being X. And then you look at surrounding communities, and we may become economically uncompetitive if we decided to implement it because theirs are at Y. So that may be a decision as we go through and evaluate that, well, okay, full cost recovery is X, but we really want to look at some level of subsidization, which would be competitive to attract businesses to the community.
The last one is a new one. The city will seek opportunities to generate additional revenue and gain further economies of scale in operations by providing services to other local jurisdiction in exchange for the full cost of the services provided. And that's part of any more, because particularly a lot of smaller cities, the cost of doing business in certain, I saw that quite a bit from the city I came from. We were doing more and more like some planning work for other communities that didn't have, they maybe only needed a part-time position, so we would assist by doing some of their work.
Yeah. In a sense, we do this now, like the jail, the court system, dispatch. So there are some services already being provided, but I guess this is stating it.
Debt management, quite a few new pieces to that one. Earlier, just clarifying debt cannot be issued or used for operating expenses, so that's new. Term of debt life, long-term debt will be structured in a manner to meet, should not exceed the asset life that is existing. The city method of sale of bonds and notes, looking at competitive pricing, that is a new section because it could be a negotiated sale or a competitive sale. Refunding of bonds, there is a section in there on refunding of bonds, but what we've added is that you want to achieve a net present value savings of at least 5%. When you start looking at anything less than 5%, when you include the overhead cost, it really is not cost effective. Legal limitation of indebtedness, that is a new section. It's basically saying that we won't exceed our limitation of indebtedness, that annually we would calculate the city's limit of an indebtedness, and that we would monitor the direct and overlapping debt of other cities to look at the overall impact to our citizens. A new policy is at a minimum, the city will retain at least 10% of its legal limit for non-voted debt for general purposes. That's still a significant, we still have a significant amount of capacity, but the rating agencies want to make sure that we've had some communities here prior to the recession. We've had several of them that had issued almost 100% of their legal indebtedness, and then as their assessed valuation went down, they exceeded that authority, and they ended up with audit findings about, and the one thing, if you're an auditor, the one thing you don't want to do is to get a finding questioning the going concern of the entity. So we had several cities in the state of Washington who went through that type of an audit, and it was really, you know, it was the first time in history we'd had ever seen anything like that. Number 7 is existing. It was rewritten to say that we would work with the fiscal agencies and manage our credit rating. Number 8 is basically saying that we'll use revenue debt over GO or LTO whenever possible.
Is that existing or?
New.
We'll never have to do this again. I'm making notes on all of this.
Conduit debt, I think that might have just been rewritten. No, new section. That's your local improvement district, your LID debt. It'll, basically says we'll use conduit debt for debt when projects need to be secured by others. So basically, when you issue LID debt, it's not the city, we're just simply the conduit to allow that private development.
So this, it does mention the guarantee fund,
Mhm.
LED guarantee fund.
Mhm.
Are you sure we don't have an existing policy about what level or percent that would be, or how that can be used?
The LID, yes, there is in state law.
Oh, it's in state law, that's right.
That says that the LID guarantee fund has to, depending on the circumstances, either have a 5% reserve of the outstanding bonds or 10%. So if, in the event that a property taxpayer did not pay the assessment, you look to the guarantee fund versus any place else to make that debt service payment. So it's just, it's saying that you can either collect money through property tax assessments or the LID guarantee fund. And you go there first.
If we, it seems to me we, in our budget though, and I'm forgetting some of the details, but I think we withdrew money from this fund.
No, what we have done is we've used it to balance the budget every year for the last many years.
Thank you.
But we've never drawn down on it.
So that's balancing at the balance. You mentioned this earlier.
It's on an appropriation, it's so, but because you generally budget conservatively, so on your revenues and your expenses, and on paper, when we do the appropriation, we've had to appropriate money from this fund to balance the budget, because we are required to have a balanced budget. But then as the year goes on, what we've generally found, because we budget conservatively, that your revenues tend to exceed, generally, your estimated appropriation, and your expenses are less than your estimated appropriation. So the first thing we try to do is draw down, what the actual transfer would be from that guarantee fund. And so we haven't had to tap into it at all to balance the budget. So there is a provision in here, if I recall earlier, that says we can utilize internal transfers from funds to balance the budget, which just can't go out and issue like geo debt to balance the operating budget.
Okay,
In
thank
one
you
of
for
these.
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gosh, I was blinking. I wasn't talking into the mic. Go ahead.
The next section is all new. This is our recommendation that utility rate studies shall be conducted at least every 5 years to update the assumptions. The utility rate revenue should be at least reviewed biennially, and necessary adjustments made to reflect inflation, construction needs, and to avoid major increases. So one would be a formal study. The other one would be simply looking at the operations and making any recommendations at an internal level. I'm starting to get tired.
How much do things like that cost, a formal study?
They generally run about $40,000 a utility.
Three.
Three.
Yes.
So, but, the downside is at some point, if you don't have good justification for the expenses, the auditor can ding you for not appropriately so it comes back to that earlier policy, which is you should consistently spend your revenues consistent with state law, which in this case, when you do charges back and forth on utilities, there should be some basis for whatever the charge is back and forth to the utility. And that helps to determine whatever that is.
Well, there'll always be a basis.
There has to be, that's right.
Whether it's
That's right.
logical or not.
Whether
Right.
you're right.
Right,
Defensible, right.
yes.
drive on.
Okay, and the last one is rates basically should be competitive and reliable.
Reliable.
Yes. The next session, accounting and financial reporting, that is in the existing policies. Basically, it says we'll follow our accounting in accordance with Washington state law. And additionally, we'll prepare such management reports and other internal reports as determined by the mayor and city administrator. And that will also keep the council updated through regular budget status reports.
So I have a question. I don't know where it fits in. It seemed to be closest to this section, but it's not really in here. Is there, and I know Bob and I have talked about this a long time ago, we have sort of an informal reimbursement policy for staff, as well as, in theory, council members. I think Bob had told me at one point it was based on IRS guidelines for travel, expenses, et cetera. Is there a formal codification of that either exists or that we should consider? Because I know, like, for council members, it's always been sort of informal that we aren't putting in for reimbursements, at least I don't. And that's just how I, always understood it. I know some cities, I've talked to other council members, and they do, whether it's for regional activities or things that we do on, council business. But it seems like it would be useful to codify that somehow, as well as staff reimbursements, so that for transparency purposes, the public knew that this is what we, as well as city staff, are doing with, those types of expenditures. And it seemed to fit kind of in this section, because it's a reporting type of thing, but I didn't know if it was a totally different thing.
The city follows IRS guidelines. Whatever the reimbursement rate is for mileage, hotels, those types of things, those are the general policies. I know one of the discussions we had on that was it didn't really apply to the council. So the council, there were some cities where their council members did get reimbursed for certain activities or mileage and those types of things. And I think the practice of the Issaquah Council has been not to reimburse council members for those items.
But truth of the matter is, the resource manual outlines the
Yes.
procedure for reimbursement for council members, that you have approval up to a certain amount, and then as it goes up, there is a current policy in the resource manual.
Yeah, is that policy, or is that, it's not, that level of detail wouldn't be here.
That would
That's
not be in
in
here.
an operational manual.
Right.
Okay.
We're in the process of rewriting the travel reimbursement policy, and it should be probably, we have several things on our plate in the finance department, but we're working on that one.
Or an audit.
Audit policy, this is a new section, but it basically indicates that we will have our financial reports audited by the state auditor. But what this also says, in certain circumstances, we may prefer, in addition to the auditor, we may contract with an outside public accounting firm to do some of our audit work if that was something we so desired. Insurance policies, this is saying that we will look at our various insurances that we provide to the city and to our employees to make sure that they remain competitive and that we are providing the best use of the financial resources for the cost of the insurance.
That's new.
That's new. Capital budget and planning, the current policy was very inclusive of procedural steps, so that entire section has been rewritten, but in its general form and context, it still remains pretty much the same. I probably took out more than what was in the original policy. So I try to just really limit it down to what is at the council level versus what's at staff and administration level.
Dan, on contingencies. Is this a state law requirement as well, or is,
It's a practice
okay,
versus state law.
okay.
The next section on overhead policy is to develop a process of improvement and efficient strategy so that we are recovering the cost of our operation. We've already talked a little bit about the cost allocation plan, and that would be forthcoming later on this year. And that would then involve a lot of policy discussion by the council on what we want to charge to other funds and what we don't want to charge to other funds. And then the last one is about actively seeking grants where appropriate, and that the sponsoring department, the city attorney, and finance will review grant applications. It also goes to say that we won't budget for grants until we have some letter or confirmation that we'll actually be receiving grants. Historically, in the past, you used to see a lot of departments wanting to budget for grants that they really hadn't received confirmation on, and then that really caused some difficulty to the budget and particularly to hiring employees based upon an expected grant. Here in the city of Issaquah, I think we do an extremely good job in working with the council because we get approval from you for the application as well as for the award. In some cities, the council only sees it when the staff has received the award. So while it's noted, it is not an issue because we already do a very good job. And that is all I have.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
And I'm actually, this is really good to see. I think this, in my first impression, it's a really good body of work, and I feel like I'm going to be able to actually fulfill my obligations better with this document, the way in this form. So I appreciate that. I see in the old version, we did specifically address mitigation fees, and you have a comment in there, not needed, part of state law.
Well, it's in here, under restricted revenues. Restricted revenues shall only be used for purposes consistent with whatever restrictions were placed upon them.
Okay, so that includes mitigation.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that word in there?
Mitigation?
Yeah.
Well,
No, but it's restricted fund.
it's a restricted
Yeah.
fund,
State
just
law.
like
By
real estate
definition.
excise tax versus all these other things.
It's just something,
It captures it.
I'm sorry?
It captures it.
Yeah, it just captures it. It's just something that it comes up, it's a topic that's so common.
So I agree,
It's a
this has been a lot of good work. I appreciate everyone's patience for hanging with it. So this is sort of a review. I do see someone in the audience, so I think I will provide a brief opportunity for public comment. If there is anyone in the audience who would desire to comment.
Had to come down.
Okay, Nancy Davidson, through the Operations Committee, did the update of the financial policy, and it went through like 6 months of review and passed through the council excruciatingly with an extensive conversation on a rainy day fund that went on and on and on and on. And this is what we got. There was a lot of unwillingness for the finance department to do a lot. So I think things have changed a lot. So this is sort of exciting because I think a lot of these things need to have happened a long time ago.
Connie?
Yeah.
Could you pull a mic up
Sorry,
so
sorry.
that
Yeah.
those,
Nancy Davidson did this a long time ago. She did, anyway, there we go. This is exciting, and then I had some questions. Mitigation, we don't actually track our mitigation funds well, especially as we went through our development agreements, and the mitigation dollars just sort of disappeared here and there, and so I'm wondering if we go through this, can we actually create a schedule for tracking the mitigation funds more appropriately so that they will actually be spent where they're supposed to? Because it's happened a lot with pretty much everything, so parks, et cetera. So, and we just simply don't have that. Another thing is when you're talking about depreciation of assets being included, we do have a lot of assets, but we also have things like ball fields where we spend massive quantities of money, yet we do not have a mechanism of starting to get money back into a fund to replace like the fields. And so I don't entirely understand when it falls into a capital asset that gets depreciated and therefore has to have reserves built up to do it again when it goes out. Police car, yes. Ball field, no. So I don't understand that. Okay. I tried to read the existing policies and the new ones side by side. And my suggestion would be to create a matrix of the old policies, that you just go down through the old policies and say policy, 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 and then the changes to those policies, the elimination of those policies, and then the reason why in the third column of the matrix. That would make sense to my part of my brain, because if I'm highly uncomfortable when I can't see what's missing. And I feel like there's policies in there that are missing because I remember going through them all. Okay. The budget decision-making needs an organizational framework like Stacy had brought up over there, because right now it doesn't feel structured. It doesn't feel like the green sheets the Development Commission had used for many years. You go through A, B, C, D to see, to make sort of a thoughtful and consistent review of the budgets by council. And then you talked, Diane, you talked quite a bit about how well the community is served. Yet I don't understand where we're going to get to the concept of how well is the community served. And if we have a particular policy question, is this serving to the community appropriately? So while we may say that, I don't understand how we're going to judge it. And so I don't know if there is something that's going to happen that I don't know about that is going to provide us with that information, because right now our level of service standards stink. Which then leads me to some complexities that I see when I start looking at the financial priorities as you funnel through, say, example, the CIP or the TIP projects. And I'm not sure that their fiscal policies fall in line with the priorities that are set out by the Public Works, Engineering, or whatever the departments are that come through with their varying things. And so if we have fighting prioritizations, I don't understand how you decide in any elegant way which priority structure should win. And I don't think the council sees the transportation grant applications. I don't think they know where all the grants that are being applied for at least transportation. I don't think I've ever seen them. So there you go. So I don't think your last statement was totally accurate. And good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Is there anyone else seeing no one else who desires to comment, are there any other comments or questions or observations before we adjourn? Diane, I think you wore us out. So with that, we are adjourned.
Just hit our stride there.
To the tomorrow project?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Start.
Yeah.
No, it is not easy to get questions